The empire thought to be the most invincible in history wasn't destroyed by barbarian armies. What destroyed Rome was counterfeit money, unpaid taxes, the black market, and starvation. Things had gotten so out of control that mothers and fathers were forced to sell their children into slavery just to pay the taxes demanded by the state. If you feel like prices are rising every time you go to the grocery store today, and that the money in your pocket is melting away day by day, fasten your seatbelts, because Rome's terrifying story of collapse is, in fact, exactly our story. Chapter 1: The Price of Wealth and the Hidden Poison. Once upon a time, living in Rome was like being on top of the world. The borders had expanded so much that the Mediterranean had practically become a massive, safe inland lake for the Romans. People were wealthy, and tax rates were comically low. You could trade from one end of the Mediterranean to the other without encountering a single pirate. But behind this magnificent dream lay a very dark poison. Rome was a state that grew rich not by producing, but by conquering. The moment there were no more new wealthy lands to conquer, the system clogged up. The state had a massive army to protect its borders, never-ending construction projects, and an insatiable bureaucracy swimming in luxury. Expenses were piling up like mountains, but the inflow of gold and silver from the outside had stopped. So what does a state do when its income dries up but its expenses don't, especially when it has to feed a giant army? It prints unbacked money, of course. Chapter 2: The Thief in the Wallet and the Destruction of the Middle Class. During the empire's golden age, a Roman coin was made of almost 100% pure silver. It was the exact equivalent of a worker's daily sweat and toil. You knew that the value of this coin would remain exactly the same even 10 years later. But when the state ran out of money, the emperors came up with a brilliant idea. Let's secretly reduce the silver in the coin and mint it with worthless copper instead. That way, we can produce more money with the silver we have and pay everyone's salaries. At first, no one noticed this trick, but as the years passed, the mints worked day and night to bribe soldiers and suppress rebellions. Those beautiful, pure silver coins eventually turned into counterfeit money with only a paper-thin layer of silver on the outside and solid copper on the inside. In fact, if you rubbed the coin in your hand a little, that cheap rusty copper underneath would show through. The public woke up. Merchants started refusing these new worthless coins. Prices skyrocketed in an instant. There came a point where, in a short span of 55 years, the price of wheat increased by exactly 4,000 times. Imagine the money you worked years to save turning into trash overnight. Because of this unbacked money the state constantly printed, the rich received the money first and added luxury to their luxury, while tradesmen, farmers, and ordinary citizens were suddenly dragged below the poverty line. Rome's powerful middle class was literally wiped out. Chapter 3: The Death Warrant and the Black Market Hell. When inflation spiraled out of control and the public was on the brink of rebellion, Emperor Diocletian stepped in. Seeing that prices were flying high, do you know where he looked for the root of the problem? In the state that kept the mints running non-stop. No, he said, inflation is happening because of greedy merchants. And he issued one of the most terrifying, most absurd laws in history: the Edict on Maximum Prices. The state fixed the prices of thousands of products. The price of an egg, a beer, a barber's shave, even a male lion you might buy as a pet was determined by the state. For those wondering, the maximum price for a lion was 150,000 denarii. And do you know what the punishment was for those who didn't sell their goods at this low price set by the state, or who secretly sold them for more? Execution, the death penalty. Did it work? Did people lower prices out of fear of death? Of course not. You cannot change the rules of economics even with the threat of death. To avoid taking a loss, producers stopped ploughing their fields, and bakeries stopped making bread. The market suddenly emptied out. A massive black market was born. People secretly bartered in dark alleys just to find a loaf of bread, and those caught by informants were executed in the middle of the street. The world's largest trade centre had suddenly turned into a starving hellscape. Chapter 4: Families selling their children, and the Roman people fleeing to the enemy. Because the money printed by the state had no value left, tax collectors no longer asked for money. They showed up at doors demanding wheat, olive oil, meat, and clothing directly. Lactantius, a writer of the era, describes those days like this: the number of tax collectors and government officials had surpassed those paying taxes. Fields were abandoned, and lands turned into forests. But the most terrifying of all was the gold tax imposed on traders and artisans. It was such a ruthless, heavy tax that historians of the time wrote there was an atmosphere of sheer mourning in the cities during tax collection periods. Mothers and fathers didn't just sell their household items to pay the state in gold and escape death. They were forced to sell their own children in slave markets or brothels. Things had reached such an unbearable point that a 5th century writer, Salvian of Marseille, expressed an unbelievable truth in his books. Roman citizens, the proudest people in the world, were abandoning their homes and taking refuge with the enemy tribes they called barbarians, whom they had fought for years just to escape these horrific taxes and state oppression. They preferred the mercy of barbarians over the tyranny of their own state. Chapter 5. Those who fled to the forest and the vengeful peasants. The Bankrupt rebellion. So did everyone flee to the barbarians? The answer is no. A group of people who had lost everything, crushed under the state's tax oppression, refused to bow down. They took to the mountains and forests. In the regions of France and Spain, farmers with nothing left to lose, bankrupt artisans, slaves, and dismissed soldiers united to form a massive rebel army. They called themselves the Bankrupt, meaning fighters. They were led by men named Amandus and Aelianus. These people were not foreign invaders, they were Rome's own people, destroyed by the system and heavy taxes. They started a bloody war against their own state and their own tax collectors that would last for hundreds of years. They even grew so powerful that they minted their own counterfeit money. Through its greed-blinded policies, the empire had single-handedly turned its own citizens into its greatest enemy. Chapter 6. Ghost towns and those imprisoned to the land. Trade in the cities had stopped, and security was gone. The wealthy and elite class that used to rule the cities had gone bankrupt due to the state's threat of, "You will pay the tax deficit out of your own pockets." What did they do as a solution? They abandoned the cities and fled to their rural estates atop mountains, surrounded by massive walls. The cities turned into ghost towns. When the state saw that the tax-paying farmers and workers were also fleeing, it delivered the final and most terrifying blow. It bound people to their birthplace and their profession by law. If you were a farmer, leaving your field was forbidden. If you were a baker, your child had to be a baker too. Rome destroyed its bustling, vibrant, free market and turned its people into slaves, working just for a bite to eat, tethered as serfs to their own land. Chapter 7. The bitter truth told by the bones. If everything I've told you sounds like just an exaggerated historical tale, listen to the findings of science. When archaeologists opened the graves, dating from the centuries after Rome's glorious era, they faced a terrifying reality. According to data from historians like Willem Jongman, by the 5th century, the amount of meat and protein the public consumed had dropped so much that malnutrition caused people's heights to shrink, and their thigh bones to dramatically decrease in size. The fall of Rome wasn't just an economic crisis on paper, it was literally physical starvation, a diseased generation, and bodily wasting away. Chapter 8. Bread, circuses, and collapse. So while people in the provinces were starving to death, selling their children, and rebelling in the forests, what do you think was happening in the capital, Rome? The state had established a massive and mind-boggling welfare system to keep the people in the centre from rebelling. About 200,000 adult men in the city, which meant a fifth of the population, were given free bread, wine, olive oil, and meat every month. The state distracted them with gladiators fighting to the death in giant arenas, literally sedating them. The famous bread and circuses policy. As long as people had their bellies filled for free and were entertained, they didn't care how the empire was rotting on the outside. This consumption by the capital was sucking the blood of the producing provinces. But the massive bill for this free life was being paid by the poor, oppressed people on the borders. And eventually, that bill became impossible to pay. Western Rome collapsed, and Europe was hurled into a dark, impoverished era that would last for hundreds of years, the Middle Ages. Conclusion on history's bitter prescription. Rome's story isn't just a tragedy left on dusty shelves. It is a massive scream thrown at us from across the centuries. If a state thinks it can get rich by printing unbacked money instead of cutting its expenses, if it believes it can beat inflation by forcing prices down by law instead of solving the root cause, if it crushes its middle class and producers with heavy taxes driven by greed, and if it sedates people with free handouts and entertainment instead of encouraging them to produce, the end of that state comes not by sword strikes but by starvation, the black market, and rotting from the inside out. Now tell me, do you think history is truly repeating itself? As we stare at the screens in our modern circuses today, can we realise how our own money and freedom are melting away. Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like the video and hit that subscribe button. Protect the value of your money, but most importantly, protect your mind and your freedom. See you in the next video.